we can get going. Welcome everybody. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your busy snow-filled lives. I know there's some folks that are going to catch up with us around 6. I anticipate this to go about an hour, and then there'll be some time for question and answers afterwards. And I'm really excited to have Brittany here. Brittany Johnson is a functional nutritionist. Yep. And owns a local company here in town where she has done some amazing work. I have a lot of friends who are athletes who have worked with Brittany and have nothing but amazing things to say. And sort of the evolution of asking Brittany to come and share a little bit of her expertise comes from, over the last few years, just diving into this question around focus and concentration a little bit deeper. And a lot of the information that's there, a lot of relevant information has to do with food. And so reached out to Brittany, and she was kind enough to spend a little time putting together some information for us tonight, and she's going to share some of that with us in depth. So we'll go ahead and get started. I gave you a small sticky pad with a little golf pencil, and I just want you to think about, real briefly, an athletic experience that you have had sometime in the past, could have been when you were a kid, could have been recently, where you felt like you were in the zone, okay? Or you were connected to your sport in a way that was different from the normal times, right? So just take a minute to think about that, and I want you to write one word that you would use to describe that experience. Hey, how's it going? Good. We just started, so hopefully maybe caught a little bit. That's okay. That's all right. So we're just taking a minute to kind of write, and we're going to come back to this later. So I'll get started. You can think about it a little bit, and I'll come grab that from you here in a minute. So one word. Yep. Yep. So just a little bit of background on what I do at the club. And my role here, I have been in the role of mindset performance coach at the club here for the last 3 years. Prior to that, a long time ago in the early 2000s, Chad was here. I coached here at the club. I was an alpine coach. From that experience, I went on to grad school, studied sports psychology. I also work in the golf world, so I teach professional golf and golf professionally. So my life really is in and around coaching and in and around the question of how do we get better. And central to this idea, what I've seen over the last few years, not just here at the club, but generally as well, is a real, what I would call, noticeable decline in the ability to focus. So what do we mean by that? So what does focus mean, right? So if you look at the standard definition, the cognitive ability to channel attention to a single task and to be fully absorbed without disruption, right? So we use an acronym in and around the work we do here with the club athletes on the mindset performance side, and we use the acronym WIN, right? So what's important now? When your mind starts going and you come to all these different outcomes and possibilities, the ability to come back and focus on what's important now, right? What do I need to do right now in this moment? So how does that affect performance, right? So the other thing we like to say a lot in sports psychology is that flow follows focus. Okay? So when we talk about flow, we're talking about what's been researched for over 40 years. It started with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in the 70s. He did a lot of research in the 80s and 90s. You probably have read a lot of his work. A highly focused mental state conducive to productivity, performance, and learning, right? And there's 4 conditions that we need to create for. And again, years of flow, years of research have gone into this. We're going to focus primarily tonight on those last 2. So clarity of goals, right? Clear and immediate feedback. Those are things that I think are in the coach domain primarily. The last 2, challenge, skill, balance, a lot of that's up to the athlete, a lot of it's up to the coach. And then the ability to focus on the task at hand, that's entirely up to the athlete, right? So we're going to focus on those last 2. primarily how to focus on the task at hand. So before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about this challenge skill balance, because I think this is really, really interesting. I think it's something that the club spends a lot of time on with the coaches. We recently had some educational workshops with Jean Cote, who is a pioneer in this field, like designing environments in and around facilitating the optimal challenge skill balance. So it kind of looks like this matrix where if you have an athlete and you've got their skill level relative to a task, so we've got low skill level all the way over to high skill level, and then we have challenge level of that task, right? And the research suggests that if you take an athlete that has perceived or actual low skill level and you put them in an environment that's low on the challenge level, apathy is typically the behavior that you'll get, right? I don't really care. Not really that interested. If you start to up that challenge level, right? So maybe you go to a race and they have that perceived or actual low skill level. That's when they'll start to transition towards worry and then anxiety, okay? Conversely, if you have an athlete that has perceived or actual high skill level and you put them in that same matrix, if the challenge is too low, you're gonna have over-relaxation. You might even have a little bit of boredom. As you start to escalate the challenge, you're gonna move them more into a sense of control, and that sense of control is the gateway to flow. Right? I like to think of this around that term self-efficacy, like that belief that I can do something, right? So I think the coaching staff, I think you as parents should know that the coaching staff at the club is very well versed in this and spends a lot of time thinking about environments. The difficulty is you have 20 kids in a training session and you have 20 different skill levels and you have generally 1 or 2 environments, right? So that's where you can start to see some challenges with this, and that's where the coaches run into some challenges. However, I think it's just an important thing as we move forward in this to think about. Okay, so what are the traits of focus, right? So when I'm on the hill and I see an athlete, I'm like, that athlete's into it. Like they are focused in the short term, long term. Typically, we see the ability to set and stay committed to specific, realistic, and measurable process goals. So process goals, goals that are in my immediate control, things I can affect with my behaviors. Listening to coaches during training, pretty straightforward. The ability to engage in conversation about their athletic process. This is a really interesting one, I think one that kind of flows into what we do at home as parents. I have 2 athletes here at the club, a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old. When I sit down at the table for dinner at night, the conversation with my 14-year-old usually goes like this. How was training? Oh, it was great. We went up to the quarry, we did this, we did that. What'd you work on? What were your cues? What are you working on with your coaches? Oh, I'm working on X, Y, and Z. I really feel like it's kind of coming along. Cool, so we have a conversation about their process. Shows me that she's got some ownership. My 11-year-old, same question. How was training? I don't know, right? It was all right. Who'd you ski with? I don't know. He has a hard time focusing, right? 2 or 3 bites into dinner, he's up playing soccer or whatever. It's like, no, come back, time to sit down. 2 or 3 minutes later, he's up doing something. So he's the one that, like, I'm really, when Brittany presents her information, I'm like, all ears, right? So that is a behavioral trait, having ownership and the ability to converse. Some of it is a maturity thing, but I've had conversations here at the club, Owen, not to point you out, but I've had conversations with Owen. Owen has ownership over his process. When you were 12 or 13, we were having conversations about what you were working on, right? How you were getting better. Commitment to, again, measurable, realistic, and specific long-term outcome goals. So we talk about with the athletes here 3 kinds of goals. Outcome goals, like what we want to happen. Process goals, how are we going to make it happen? And then resonance goals, why do we want to do this? So those athletes that can commit to long-term outcome goals and stay committed to them over the long run generally have high levels of focus. They don't get distracted easily, right? So there's short-term focus and there's long-term focus, okay? I put this little acronym at the bottom because it's a term we use a lot with the athletes, IAC, intention, attention, and commitment. What are you intending to do? What's your attention going to be on when you do it? And how committed are you going to stay to it? So we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. All right, so we're going to get into the meat of so when we dive into the research around what are the challenges, so if we have an athlete that's not able to exhibit these traits we just put up on the previous slide, what are the challenges to that? And the research says there's 5 big things. Lack of sleep, lack of good sleep, okay? Hunger and dehydration, which are short-term things. We're all pretty familiar with those, right? And these last 2 we're really going to dive into. Unhealthy eating habits and stress management. Those are probably the 2 biggest things that affect short-term, long-term focus. Okay. I love this picture, like a child of the 90s, growing up with the Dream Team, Michael Jordan. Remember the McDonald's commercials that were just like over and over and over? You would never see that. I mean, it's so crazy to me that our culture just pumps it out. Like, yeah, it's fine. I'm gonna go play, 120 basketball games in a season. I'm gonna eat McDonald's. Like, that's really probably not gonna happen. All right, so let's get into the science a little bit. So Brittany has an unbelievable amount of cool information. And the science of how food affects focus, I'm gonna talk a little bit when she's finished about some stress management and how we use the Mindset Performance Program here at the club to help with that. But she's gonna talk about food. And the research is suggesting on bigger and bigger levels that food is huge. And what I'm not gonna talk about, what you're not gonna hear us talk about much tonight, and I bet what you maybe thought we were gonna talk about was technology. Technology plays a role, but it's not the biggest driver of athletes' ability to focus. Food, sleep, stress management, those are the biggest, okay? So the brain uses about 20% of all the energy produced by the body. Interestingly enough, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I didn't put it in a slide, but a brain cell uses about 20% more energy than a normal body cell, okay? So the brain is more dependent on energy than the body in a lot of ways. There's a lot of, Brittany's gonna touch on this, there's a lot of good nutrients in food that stimulate oxygen flow, blood flow to the brain, increase learning, memory, brain function, and acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that, when coupled with adrenaline, aids in the ability to focus. So the analogy that we use a lot with the athletes is like this. So your ability to concentrate has to do with how well you can harness adrenaline, okay? Especially when you're in highly stressful environments, competitions, races, events. So when we get that physiological response to stress, we get a lot of adrenaline in our body, and that's essentially what we're experiencing from a physical standpoint. Kids will experience butterflies, right? Blood moving around. They'll experience handshaking a little bit, shortness of breath, heart increases, all healthy responses to an increase in adrenaline, okay? Now, that's all good as long as you can harness it. And acetylcholine is one of those neurotransmitters, in addition to dopamine, that is sort of like the point on the arrow. So if adrenaline's the shaft, those 2 neurotransmitters are the point, okay? So what's the biggest thing that affects those 2 neurotransmitters? Sleep, water, and food. Okay. So if we get athletes that are underslept, undernourished, dehydrated, and we put them in an event with a bunch of adrenaline response, not gonna go well. Right? It's all stuff we kind of know, but I think the practical question is, how do we change that? Like, how do we change that environment, okay? So I'm gonna let Brittany come up and do really the heavy lifting, and this is really a pleasure to introduce her and have her come up and talk about these slides. And I will, if you want, I can read the slides, or you can just go arrow.
Yeah, that's probably fine.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Go back there.
Great. Well, once again, really feel privileged and honored to be here and to have the opportunity to just have an informal conversation with other like-minded steamboaters. Just, I guess, a quick history on me. I've lived in town for almost 15 years now. Have not had a very linear path like most of us. Have done many things and worn many hats over the years. I think it's really special that we have this community in the way that so many of us value and cherish, and I can only imagine what that would have been like as a young athlete if I had grown up in a town like this. I do have an athletic background, but it pales into comparison when you're, amongst Olympians like so many of us are. But I am a former D1 athlete, and I have a Big Ten championship under my belt in women's rowing. I grew up playing competitive soccer at the Olympic development level. And then when I moved to Steamboat very serendipitously after undergrad, learned to ski at 23. 3 years later, became a guide with Steamboat Powder Cats. This is my 11th season guiding for Powder Cats. I'm an adjunct faculty member at CMC, teaching mountain biking and avalanche education and intro to ski guiding. I also, as Luke mentioned and why I'm here tonight, went back to school in 2015 for a nutrition program with the Nutritional Therapy Association, and then kind of shelved that, started Cloverdale Farm, for those that are familiar with that. So honestly, my interest in nutrition and wellness is really rooted in our food system and food policy and kind of ground zero, just what we're putting on our plate, regardless of whether that's fueling performance and or driving wellness. And after several years kind of being in that space, transitioned to starting my own practice, went back to school to layer in functional lab work, and have been slowly kind of growing that space ever since. And as far as food is concerned within this context, from a focus and a concentration standpoint, there really is a lot that we can do from a food standpoint. And I want to just acknowledge first and foremost, though, that as parents, I realize, even though I'm not a parent myself, I've done, lots of nannying and childcare over the years in informal and formal ways, but I realize it can be really challenging to figure out how to support your kids in this way. And so I'm here hopefully tonight to just drive home why we want to remain resilient in that space in supporting them, and then hopefully have some practical tips for you to try and bring home into your own kitchens in that capacity. So to build off of what Luke was just saying, and this is becoming more and more prevalent in the mainstream, this concept of the gut-brain connection. And so there's a lot more research coming out to support what's known as this gut-brain axis, which now some experts are calling the gut the second brain. And this has a lot to do with the fact that microbiota are super important in helping to regulate that brain activity and those cognitive functions, and that there is a neurotransmitter synthesis pathway via the intestines, and so that's where a lot of this communication is taking place. More importantly, a lot of our neurotransmitters are actually made in the gut and then having this influence on the brain from that standpoint. It's estimated that 90% of the body's serotonin is made in the digestive tract, is just one example of that. And that the main takeaway here with this is that changes in our dietary habits and environment can lead to changes in that gut microbiota, and then that's going to subsequently influence that neurotransmitter pathway and the synthesis of those components within brain, focus, concentration, et cetera. And so just to start off, I wanted to point to how we can support that just with brain boosting nutrients, and then also helping to support gut function through gut supportive nutrients as well. So first with brain boosting foods. So some simple things if we're looking to just support focus, concentration from this mental standpoint. As Luke already pointed out on that last slide, the brain is overwhelmingly comprised of fats. And there are 3 different types of primary fats: saturated fats, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. We need all 3. Saturated fats have been demonized wrongly for a number of decades, and so we're still breaking this misdialogue around saturated fats as being healthy for us, despite what we might have otherwise been told. It's a very old narrative. In addition to them, serving lots of different roles and places, they are best suitable from a high heat tolerant standpoint. So we can look at fats on a sliding spectrum. Saturated fats are the most stable, the most heat tolerant, and so these tend to be the best cooking fats. They certainly can be consumed in other capacities as well, but if we're cooking and using things at high temps or grilling, these have the most stability and are going to remain the most, like they're going to retain their integrity at those high temps. Monounsaturated, these are kind of that in between, and they're still great at a low to moderate heat temp. Things like olives, extra virgin olive oil, avocados, all forms, several types of nuts, and then our polyunsaturated fats. These are best for no heat finishing. These are the least stable. They're the most prone to oxidation. And so they lose their integrity when they're exposed to heat, to light, and to things of that nature that are going to oxidize them quickly. So things like fatty fish, walnuts, walnut oil, flax, sesame oil, chia seeds, these are all great forms of polyunsaturated fats. But this is where there's a little bit of a conundrum and a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation. I know there's a lot of noise in this space, and this is where it can be really hard to know what's best for us, because a lot of the mainstream outdated medical community is still pushing things like vegetable oils, seed oils, canola oil. These are all polyunsaturated fats. And as I was just saying, they oxidize really quickly when exposed to light and heat in its simplest definition. And to process and make those types of fats, they're underneath the scrutiny of light, heat, excessive processing. They're chemical agents and deodorizing agents and solvents are being used to stabilize them, to rid them of their rancid smells. And so this can sometimes be a very shocking piece of information, since most of our kitchens contain these oils, and we tend to have them stored above our oven area, right, or above our stove, and then we have heat kind of affecting them there. And so that, I'm not somebody who likes to demonize foods or say that things are good or bad. I just don't operate in that way. But this would be one of the few exceptions to that, is really trying to avoid and minimize those types of fat. It's like one of the, if you're going to do one thing from a dietary standpoint that's going to have the biggest bang for its buck, because these are things that are driving inflammation in the body, it would be to really cut back on these things and avoid their use when possible. Other really great brain boosting foods, again, just reiterating the fatty fish piece, this is such a great option here. Things like salmon, mackerel, oysters, sardines. I know foods that even adults oftentimes aren't really stoked to eat, but if you can find ways to kind of sneak those things in, super nutrient dense, and the brain loves those things. Antioxidant rich foods. This is really just coming down to real whole nutrient dense foods, but things like berries, leafy greens, a lot of your fiber rich plants, lots of colorful vegetables, these are all antioxidant rich foods, as most of us know, but the less processed forms of those, the more likely you are to have that increase in nutrient density that's going to support those things. Nuts and seeds, a lot of these are precursors to help create those neurotransmitters. Green tea contains polyphenols and L-theanine, also great brain boosting nutrients. And then not skipping meals, especially, and then as an athlete, this is, again, there's a lot of nuance and context to baseline nutrition, performance-based recommendations. So these things might not apply to somebody who's not an athlete, but for somebody who is working out regularly, sometimes several times a day, your metabolism is constantly going. And so you are somebody who falls into a category of probably needing to refuel and make sure that you are well fueled going into and post event. And so eating every 3 to 5 hours for most people is going to also help keep that attention span sharp, that focus and concentration on point. Maybe?
You might have to hit, I think that little.
Oh, that's what's going on. There's a password.
Yeah. I don't know why that popped up.
Uh-oh.
Should be good.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Okay, so moving on to how, since the brain and the gut are connected, how are we then also supporting our gut in just some basic, simple ways, especially with food first? So cultured dairy, if you're somebody who tolerates dairy, is going to be a great source of probiotic-rich foods, ideally full fat, plain, unsweetened, pastured if possible. Fermented and other pre and probiotic-rich foods, so things like kimchi, which is pickled Asian vegetables. You have kefir, which is another form of cultured dairy. Beet kvass, which is a fermented form of beets and in liquid form as well as in pickled form. Sauerkraut, miso, kombucha, other raw, cultured and pickled vegetables. Tempeh, which is fermented soy. And then again, cultured dairy. Fiber-rich foods, so fiber is going to really help support the microbiota in our gut, as well as at the tail end of that system, specifically in the colon. So again, things like veggies and greens, psyllium husk powder and other psyllium products, oat bran, legumes, beans, and resistant starches. A list of some examples of resistant starches. So these essentially resist digestion. So again, they kind of get left behind in the GI tract and allow our beneficial flora to kind of feed and prosper off of those foods. Bone broth and collagen are also really great gut nourishing foods where you can layer those things in. And then things that we really want to minimize. This is not, again, about demonizing foods by any means. I'm going to talk about this here in just a second, how food represents lots of things for us. It's fuel, yes, but it's also meant to be enjoyed and indulged upon. And so this is not about saying that we have to have a perfect diet by any means, but minimizing excess sugar and heavily processed, refined, and packaged foods. Those things compound over time and are going to have a degrading effect on the gut if we're allowing that to be the staple of our diet. And then parasympathetic eating. So in the brain, this is referring to our nervous system and its various little tracts. To be able to digest, we have to be able to move our nervous system into this parasympathetic state versus in the sympathetic state that most of us live in, which is our fight or flight state. And especially in today's day and age, with modern society being as stressful and crazed as it really is, most of us hang out here even if we're not aware of it, and this shuts down digestion. So digestion really does begin in the brain, and if we're not able to switch into that parasympathetic state, we're going to create dysfunction that starts with our digestive incapacity and is going to impact the gut downstream of it. So things that we can do to support and encourage parasympathetic eating is to actually sit down and slow down, so not eating meals on the go, taking a few deep breaths before a meal. Like this is actually probably where the concept of saying grace really originated from. So regardless of that side of things, it's more just like tuning in to and presencing yourself to your meal, taking a few deep breaths, chewing your food well, like actually truly masticating it. That's like, again, after the brain component, the next first step in breaking down our food pre-digestion, and then minimizing those distractions as well. All right, so what are characteristics of healthy eating for young athletes? And this quote, I think, is really the main takeaway here, is a fueled body performs better than a starved body. And that just drives home the fact that most people, most athletes, young athletes, adults, were under-fueling for the activities that this town is built upon. And so being a bit more intentional around that, and I've got some tips for you from a foundational standpoint. So a couple of main principles with this, and this is really how I operate within my one-on-one practice, is respecting this concept of bioindividuality. What works for one person may or may not work for another. That's why there is no magic bullet to what is going to be the best approach for you or your young athlete at home. We have to kind of trial and error and find what works best for you. Real food supports real health. So prioritizing real, nutrient-dense, minimally processed whole foods as often as possible. This is the bedrock of wellness as much as it is on performance. Again, this is not about not leaning on some of those quicker go-to staples and utilizing things that save us time, but recognizing, as the fourth bullet point kind of speaks to, that the things that we are consistent with is really what's going to lay the groundwork for the outcomes that we seek, whether that's in just general health or, again, in that performance space. And real food is at the heart of that. Quality matters. Doing the best that we can with the resources we have. I am fully aware of how privilege influences this space and how we all have different access to different resources, both from an education and awareness standpoint as much as from a dollar standpoint. So again, this is not about criticizing anyone for what they can or cannot do. It's adopting more of like a good, better, best mentality and doing the best with the knowledge and the resources you can, and being okay with that. It's really where it all kind of starts. Consistency is greater than perfection. So again, food is fuel, but it's also a lot more than just fuel. And it's our consistent habits that are going to determine that long-term health and performance outcomes. So again, this isn't about not having the cookie or the baked good or the cinnamon roll, right? Like those have a place, especially if we, A, just want to enjoy those things, or B, are using it intentionally in and around our activities, but still recognizing that if that's the only way that we're eating, at some point those things are probably going to catch up with us. So what are we consistently doing? What are our consistent habits? And then building a balanced meal. So what is a balanced meal? Ooh, forgive me, I forgot that that is on a weird little timer there. Balanced meals consist of protein, vegetables, some form of a complex carb, and healthy fats, specifically to this athlete realm. And so we can think of protein as something that's going to provide satiety, and it's also really useful from a recovery standpoint. Vegetables, this is where we're going to get a lot of that fiber, phytonutrients, all those antioxidants. Protein and healthy fats are also quite nutrient dense, but vegetables are really going to help support the foundation of that. Complex carbs we can think of as performance fuel and also aiding in recovery. So we really want to focus on carbohydrates pre, during, and post event or activity. And then healthy fats, these are where we're going to source those really, really important fat-soluble vitamins. They also are going to help keep us satiated and full for longer, and they can be a long-burning fuel source when used amongst some of these other components. And so general rule is striving to eat our last balanced meal 2 to 3 hours before an activity, and then within 1.5 to 3 hours post-activity. So as parents, this is where we can start to set up our kids, whether that's their meal before they go to school, specifically dinner perhaps after their weekday training, and then I have some other practical advice for that in between where you have a little less control and there's a lot of moving parts. But thinking about just balanced meals, starting our day, ending our day is like a really great place to start.
And I would just add really quick while you're changing slides there, this is probably the thing I see the most on the ground with groups, specifically when they travel to races, is the plan before the race. So the night before, sort of what are my meals going to look like for that day? In the program, I'll show you here in a little bit, we have online, we have an event worksheet that athletes can use that sort of scripts out how that day is going to look, from when they're going to wake up to what they're going to eat, what time they're going to eat it. Because I think that's the biggest thing we see practically is athletes are going to these resorts, they don't really know what options are going to be there. You know, if they ask the coaches obviously are going to kind of help them get it formulated, but oftentimes it's just having that plan as opposed to just showing up, you know, at the base of Aspen Mountain and kind of looking around for like, oh, should I find a bagel somewhere, you know? So I think that's a really important point.
And, you know, and even if it comes down to like, I didn't plan, but I will say like a lot of this, let me back up. We live, as I already mentioned, in a very stressful, fast-paced, modern society where none of us have enough hours in the day. So I'm not here to not recognize and heed the fact that all of us are probably juggling more than we would like. And yet, this is a really key component to setting athletes especially up for success. We have to have a little bit of foresight when it comes to intentionally fueling, and because we're not just the general public, there is more thought and time and prep that does need to go into that. But to Luke's point, when sometimes that's not possible, even just recognizing that that's your recipe for a balanced meal and then trying to work with what you have is still better than not having that knowledge at all and completely just, you know, throwing it out the window. Okay, so the other point that Luke mentioned when we're talking about just things that influence mental focus is hydration or lack thereof. Not dissimilarly to how much fat really influences brain health, water really influences just general health, since 60+% of the body is comprised of water in some way or form, and yet dehydration, as so many of us know, is super common. It's essential for so many essential processes in the body. It transports nutrients and waste. It's maintaining proper cell-to-cell communication and proper electrical charges within the body. It helps to regulate body temperature. It cushions our bones and joints. So water plays as important of a role as all of us know, and yet we're all, guilty of dropping the ball on this more often than we'd like to admit. So from a general guideline standpoint, half your body weight in ounces per day is typically a good goal to strive for. Certainly not more than that, and we would cap that at 100 ounces per day regardless of body size. But that's helping to create a bit of that bio-individual component just based on size, weight, et cetera. Adding some sea salt to all forms of water will really help to help with absorption, and that's because water in our body is all mineralized. None of the water in our body doesn't have minerals or electrolytes in it. Like is attracted to like. And so when we drink plain water, this is oftentimes why when we start to increase our water consumption, we're running to the restroom. And this will help to retain some of that. It's not going to completely, make you avoid running to the bathroom, but it is going to help in some extent because it's now been mineralized. It doesn't need to taste salty at all. That certainly is becoming more of a new age thing with companies like Element kind of coming out on the scene with super high salt content, but that's kind of what it's getting at. And as the next section really points to, if you're sweating, like we do want to be adding electrolytes. Come on in if you would like to join us. Other things that help with just general hydration, filtered water, herbal teas, bone broths, and then like your food, vegetables and fruit that have higher water content are also very hydrating to the body. Specifically during and post sport, so again, super bio-individual here, but striving for anywhere from 14 to 24 plus ounces per hour. And within that 1 hour post activity is also advised. Again, anytime you're sweating, we should be adding electrolytes. Plain water, we're losing primarily sodium, but also potassium, magnesium from our sweat. And so when we are sweating, even in winter, when we don't necessarily feel like we're sweating, electrolytes are really, really important from a performance standpoint. Other things that influence that amount of water per hour rate, again, bio-individuality, people have different sweat rates. The intensity or duration of your event is going to influence that, certainly altitude and environment. So that's just a bit of a starting point for that. But playing around with that and seeing what works best for you. Thinking about warm beverages in the winter, that's a lot more motivating to drink when you're outside and it's freezing out. And so warming up things like a Scratch sports hydration mix, or hot lemon water with a little bit of sea salt, warm herbal tea, things like that. And then even considering a water-based recovery drink post, but even honestly during, especially for longer events. When I've been out in the field teaching for AVI courses, I've been using like the Scratch recovery mix, which has a little bit of protein. It also has carbohydrates. I'm adding a little bit of the chocolate mint element packets to that, and a warm beverage. It's like drinking a hot cocoa, but it has a lot of good stuff for you in it. You had a question?
Yeah, so is the body weight in pounds or kilograms?
That's a great question. I have not been asked that. I would say by pounds. So if you can, since most of us are not on metric here in the United States, just staying different out there. But yeah, and again, like it doesn't have to be science. Striving for about half your body weight and or a little less unless you were super active and sweating a bunch. Okay, and then some performance-specific strategies, and this is, again, parents certainly apply this in your own athletic pursuits, but where you can set your kids up for success pre, during, and post. These are the main takeaways. So again, 2 to 3 hours before an event, that's where we want to try and set our kids up with a balanced meal like we talked about. If you have an hour and a half or less, this is where simple or complex carbs with maybe a small amount of fat or protein is going to be best utilized, and certainly minimizing fiber. So essentially the takeaway here is the closer we get to an event, whether that's a training or an actual race or competition, the simpler and quicker we want our food to be able to be digested. And so that's where starting to minimize fat and protein, and certainly minimizing fiber and prioritizing complex carbs and or some simple carbs with a little bit of fat and protein in that 90-minute or window or less is going to help minimize GI stress before an activity. And then especially if it's like right at the start line and we maybe just need another quick boost, that's where these simple carbs, 30-ish grams right at the start, can help give us a quick little boost, even if we've already fueled, but if we're just feeling like we want to top off the tank, essentially. during sport. So the higher the intensity, the simpler your fuel. That's the main takeaway here. So lower intensity, so like those longer, drawn out, endurance-based activities, trainings, and maybe even competitions, generally, this is all relative, but generally are going to be lower intensity if they're longer events, right? This is where complex carbs are really going to shine, and or those simple carbs with a little bit of fat and protein. Otherwise, things that are high intensity based, simple carbs and things that are just easy to chew and are palatable are going to be the things that we want to prioritize during activity.
Can you give some like examples of what you mean by simple carbs here?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
That's coming up on the next couple of slides, absolutely. And then from a duration standpoint, so these are things, again, duration and intensity are the things that are influencing what we want to prioritize when, like during an event and when we are needing to continue to fuel. So if the event is less than an hour or an hour and a half and you properly fueled beforehand, you probably don't need to fuel during that event. So that's, again, where just making sure you go into an event properly fueled. Hour and a half, again, there are exceptions here, but most people are not going to necessarily need to fuel in that window. Bumping up on the other side of that, so greater than that hour and a half, this is where we want to start replacing fuel to avoid a bonk. And that's where 30 to 60-ish grams of carbs after the first hour, if you properly fueled, is going to be appropriate. Again, matching the type of carb to the intensity. Essentially, you want to replace about half of the calories that you're burning every hour beyond that first hour is the other way to phrase that. Greater than 2.5 hours, again, this is where you might have a higher carb need per hour. And then certainly if you're out there for 3, 4, 5+ hours, those mega endurance events, this also kind of applies to more like back-to-back events or training. This is where we want to bring in a little bit of protein and fat because carbs are what are keeping us fueled. Protein and fat is what's staving off hunger. And so when we get into that window where it's longer than 3, 4, 5 hours, we have to have a little bit of protein and fat so that we're not getting hungry. Carbs aren't just going to cut it at that point. And then post-sport, I like the takeaway, you aren't finished until you're recovered. So we're refueling, this is the 3 R's. We refuel with carbs, we rebuild with protein, and we want to stay and rehydrate from our event. So from an endurance standpoint, a 4-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein tends to satisfy most people's needs. And then if it's more of a strength recovery, that's where we would maybe flip that and it's a 2-to-1 carbs to protein. We have a little bit more protein when we're recovering from a strength workout. Ideally, we're consuming a smaller snack within 30 to 45 minutes of finishing training or a competition with, again, 20 to 40 grams of carbs, 10 to 20 grams of protein, depending on what that activity just was. And then an hour and a half to 3 hours after the event, that's when we're bringing back a balanced meal. So for parents, like the takeaway here is what are some good snacks to throw in your kid's bag, right? Obviously pre, during, and post. And so we're gonna move into that in the next couple of slides here. Yeah.
You talked about gut stress. Are there outward symptoms of that you can recognize?
That might be a conversation to have on the side after the fact, just since it might steer us a little bit away from the main. There are, yes, absolutely. And some of them are obvious and others may be less obviously associated with the gut. But yes, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you on the side about that afterwards. Okay, so the main takeaways from all of that before I give you guys some practical examples of things to just have in mind for your kids and families. Nutrition plays a big role in supporting mental focus and concentration in sport, along with just general training and competing needs. Most athletes, kids, adults alike, are not eating enough to support their training and recovery efforts. Underfueling, especially not consuming enough quality carbohydrates, often is going to result in poor overall health, cognitive decline, hormonal disruptions, and decreased athletic performance. That's not to say, though, that carbs are the only thing we want to be eating. All 3 of the macros, as we've just talked about, are super important and have a place for athletes on a daily basis, especially those quality carbs. Consistent, quality, balanced meals are the foundation of optimal health and sustained performance. Oh, I think that thing came up again, Luke, sorry.
Let's see here. technology,
Yeah,
right?
not my strength either. Perfect. Good job. Okay. No, that's okay. You're good. The higher the intensity, the simpler, the faster your fuel should be, and that you aren't finished training or competing until you've properly recovered the three R's. So this really just drives home the fact that winners and losers have the same goals, but the difference is how we set out to achieve them. So again, there are a lot of things we can be doing with food and with nutrition. And another way of thinking about it is, what are you doing that is setting you apart from your competition? And this is certainly an area that can give you that upper edge. Okay, so pre-effort, some examples here of a balanced meal. This is just one example just to kind of paint a picture for you all. So 2.5, 3 hours before an event, a rice and an egg bowl. So this looks like about a cup of either brown rice, which is more of a complex carb, white rice, simple carb. That can be preference too. Some people just feel better eating one over the other. A couple of eggs in there, cooked to your style, throwing in some fresh greens to preference, bringing in some healthy fats, whether that's some avocado and or maybe some extra virgin olive oil or some toasted sesame seed oil, and then flavoring it to taste. Done, simple. If you have an hour and a half or less before your event, this is where maybe some pre-made things, or maybe you have prepped some things. A lot of these things can be made ahead of time and stored in your fridge or your freezer. I'm a huge fan of Scratch products. They also, if you're not aware, put out recipes on their blog. They also have a cookbook. They have a portables cookbook, which is specific for athletes. I highly recommend those as resources. They have a sweet rice porridge, which you can find on their blog. It's like a spin off of oatmeal, but using white rice instead. Toast with a little bit of nut butter, banana, honey. You could certainly sub in some oats for the toast and berries for bananas, but that's gonna kind of primarily give you some complex carbs with a little bit of fat and protein, but not too much to tip the scale for most. Something like a half of a bagel with cream cheese and jam. So again, this is something that you can easily find if you're a little less prepared and you're scrambling. To the Scratch cookbook, they have some really great egg and rice muffin recipes. I made a few of these this summer when I was training for the Grand Traverse, and they are like perfect pocket size, and you can take them out like on the go, which is super easy and convenient. Another staple that most of us have in our kitchens, just granola with some berries and some coconut milk, just a slightly higher fat content. Certainly you could use a full fat plain cow milk as well. This is a little bit different, but also like really savory and can really hit the spot. But mashed potatoes with some Parmesan, extra virgin olive oil, salt and pepper, and then dried fruit, super easy to have that on hand as well. Having like a nut butter packet, these are things you can have on the go, stick in your pocket, throw it in the bag, whether you're traveling or not. And EA is essential amino acids. That's just another like quick boost. It's not hugely calorically dense, but it can provide your muscles with a bit of an amino acid profile right before, during, or after an event, which can be helpful as well. And again, pre-hydrating, and if you're gonna have that quick snack at the start line, shooting for about 30 grams of simple carbs. That is as simple as just going to the grocery store and on any of those like quick packets, just having a quick glance at the nutrition facts and things that are primarily just carbs, simple sugars that are in that 30-ish gram range. And I have a couple of examples coming up as well. So during and between efforts, this would be a great one to just screenshot, honestly, and we can, obviously this is recorded, you can come back and check this out. A lot of different whole food and packaged recommendations, depending on if it's more of a low intensity, endurance-based activity, or if it's a shorter, bursted, high intensity example. So from a whole food standpoint, low intensity, these are great things to you could prep at the start of your day when you're getting kids maybe their lunch ready to go. Would be some hard cheese with some apple slices and maybe a few slices of salami as a snack in between school and practice, especially if it's not going to be on the high intensity side of things. Orange slices, some dark chocolate, some pistachios. Again, you're getting some carbs, you're getting some sugar, you're getting a little bit of protein and fat from those pistachios. Boiled potatoes with some Parmesan and butter and salt and pepper. Again, prioritizing a complex carb, but still bringing in a little bit of protein and fat with that butter and the cheese component. high intensity alternatives that are homemade. So, and these are things that can be, again, prepped and partitioned off and just kept in your freezer. Really utilizing the Scratch blog and Portable's cookbook, but I'm a big fan of those. You can make a cinnamon apple rice cake, you can do sweet potato cakes, or you can just make some of your own homemade favorites using just homemade quality ingredients, things like banana and pumpkin bread, raspberry crumble bars, blondie bars. This is where cookies can certainly have a place. Cinnamon rolls, like having something like that, if it's palatable to you and isn't gonna upset your stomach pre or during, these are great, simple, high intensity fueling tactics that if that works for you, this is the time and the place for those. Packaged options, so a lot of great options there in that lower left corner. I'm a big fan of the Hugh Hunks chocolate covered cashews, so you've got some chocolate with some nuts. Again, grabbing some dried mango or banana. The Quinn brand peanut butter pretzels is a big fan of mine, and I'll pair that with some dried strawberries. Crackers with jerky and nut butter packets. So again, we can still use packaged and processed foods, but this is where that good, better, best component of trying to source quality where resources allow is helping to set that consistent foundation. We still have options as consumers. It's really just kind of shifting our mindset away from some of the staples that we maybe are relying on that don't necessarily meet that criteria. And then even over here on the high intensity side, like I'm still a component of gummies and gels and even candy bars and cookies. Again, those things have a place. It is still just remembering what are we consistently consuming and trying to be mindful of that. I'm also a huge component of using a hydration mix that doesn't necessarily just fit this high intensity standpoint. That's across the board. That's a slow drip of carbohydrates alongside electrolytes, and so that's another form of fueling regardless of your intensity level that's helping to provide simple carbs with that electrolyte replacement. And then certainly remembering your hydration and recovery component to that, which leads us to this. So some quick, within the 30 to 45 minute window, that carb protein snack. Again, some homemade versus some quicker pre-made options, so that just grabbing a sports recovery drink. And again, I'm a big fan of Scratch, good quality ingredients, great taste component to it, super simple and easy. You can stash that in its bag. All it needs is water. You can certainly, if you have access to it, make a smoothie where it's all homemade, real food ingredients. And then something as simple as having gone to the store and having some fresh fruit or cottage cheese on hand, or this is where those PB&Js and peanut butter and honey sandwiches can come into play as well. Great, quick after effort recovery in that 30 to 45 minute window. Strength efforts, slightly different. Essentially the main takeaway there is slightly higher protein, a little less carbs. And then within that 1.5 to 3 hours, the balanced meal. And this is where the balanced meal ratio kind of changes again based on that intensity piece, where we still want to have carbs, protein, vegetables, and fat on our plate. And if it was a lower intensity day, maybe that looks a little more equitable. But on that higher intensity day, that's where we're really trying to refuel with carbs and still have a good amount of protein, vegetables, and fat, but it's just a slightly higher ratio of that. A couple of good examples: coconut veggie green curry with some mashed plantains and chicken for a very balanced, equitable ratio standpoint. Where we're moderate intensity, so a bit more carbs and protein really is the takeaway, a little bit less on the veg side. Mashed sweet potatoes, we've got roasted Brussels sprouts, grilled steak, and some truffle extra virgin olive oil. And then when we really need a lot of those carbs, bringing in a bit more brown rice, more veggies, some baked salmon, coconut aminos. And again, you can screenshot that. I'm always open to follow-up questions, but that's kind of the bulk of it. And I really hope that that is giving you guys some direction and support in that space.
And we'll send these slides out as well. I know we tried to put, Brittany certainly put a lot of information on here with the hope that this would be stuff we could give you to take home and kind of, siphon through at your own pace. But we'll just summarize and kind of end with some of the tools that are available to athletes here at the club from a stress management standpoint. And I think Brittany hit the nail on the head in terms of looking at the nervous system as a balanced unit and trying to activate that parasympathetic side of our nervous system as often as possible. I really think, in my experience working with athletes, that is the key. That is what separates elite level athletes that have longevity from those that don't, is their ability to recover and their ability to tap into that parasympathetic side of their nervous system more often. So what does that look like? Progressive relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing, non-sleep, deep rest, mindfulness meditation, reading, walking, all of these things activate that PNS. A couple of metrics you can use to measure that with athletes are resting heart rate and heart rate variability. So a lot of people have smartwatches now, or Whoops, that will measure these for us. And there's a lot of information out there about how to do that. I think the most important thing, especially as the athletes are getting towards that 16, 17, 18-year-old range, is just having a daily awareness of where they are. So wearing a Whoop or wearing a watch and just looking at it in the morning and starting to correlate things they did the day before, foods they ate, water they may have drank or not, sleep they either got or didn't, and how that affects their resting heart rate and their heart rate variability. Generally, we want to see athletes have a baseline and stay pretty close to that baseline. Typically, as they go into the high stress part of their season, kind of March, April, we'll see that baseline start to elevate, and then we want to bring it back down, right? I'm going to show you where some of these tools are in the program, but just touch briefly on sleep hygiene and technology. I really thought when I started looking more deeply at this question about focus and concentration, our ability to stay focused on a singular task for more than a few minutes, I really thought it was going to be in technology. I know I certainly find a lot of distraction in technology, and technology companies are designed, and their business models are based around dividing and gaining our attention over and over and over, right? And certainly the brain is very subject to that approach. However, I think the biggest effect technology has on our ability to focus and concentrate is what it does to our sleep patterns. And the technology now is research is suggesting that screens 2 hours before bed are the best way to go, so eliminating those screens. And then having natural light within the first hour of being awake is the most important thing to producing melatonin in our body. So melatonin obviously helps us sleep. What do most of us do? I know I'm guilty of this. Did this morning, rolled over, check that phone, right? What do I got to do today? Start looking through it. I get that blue light right off the bat. Research would suggest that that phone probably shouldn't come out until after I've been awake for about an hour or so. I have a hard time doing that. I can't imagine how hard that is for a lot of 14, 15, 16-year-olds. But that's what the research is suggesting. So a good sort of hack is to have some box, and some of you may do this, but have a box somewhere where you can put the phones 2 hours before bed, and then they don't come out after you've been awake for an hour. Hard to do, but I think an effective approach. So in terms of managing those environments, athletes U14 and up have access to our online platform that has a whole host of tools and skills that they can tap into. If they click on this energy management, focus and concentration section, there's quite a bit that comes up. You can see here we have a progressive relaxation script that they can listen to. We have body scans that they can listen to. We have focus and concentration exercises, box breathing, coherent breathing, alternating nasal breaths. Parachute breathing is probably the one we use the most on the ground with the athletes. And when athletes that I work with on the hill are having issues, certainly in the short term, this is the one the research is suggesting has the most effect in the shortest amount of time. That's simply 2 inhales, 1 long exhale, okay? It really works best, though, if there's some sort of consistent diaphragmatic nasal breathing practice that the athlete is partaking in on a daily basis. So that's just waking up in the morning and breathing for a few minutes, okay? There's also some links here to some NSDR scripts. NSDR is just another way of activating that parasympathetic side of our nervous system, okay? So these tools are there, and I can send you all the link if you would like to tap into that yourself. Again, U14 and up, coaches have sent this to all the groups. I've presented to all the groups. They kind of know where to find it and how to tap into those. So in summary, It's a complicated question, but I think the ability to focus and concentrate really has the biggest crux of the issue is in what we put into our body from a food standpoint, how much sleep we get, and how often we activate that parasympathetic side of our nervous system. It's those three. And I think as parents, I think about this a lot, having athletes. I didn't so much, let me put it this way. I used to think it was knowing what to say, when to say it. Now I think it's managing environments and not saying much. I really think that's the key in terms of successful athletic parenting, right? Because it doesn't matter what we say as parents when they win or lose, right? What matters is that we're there, we're smiling, right? We enjoyed our experience. It's really the 23 and a half hours before that that we sort of set up that environment without saying much. That's the key. And if there's anything that you can take away from tonight, hopefully there's a couple good food ideas there. I know I took a couple away. And hopefully you can encourage your athletes to tap into some of these tools and exercises, because I think it goes a long way. So thank you for your time. We've got some time for questions. I told you we go an hour. It's an hour and 7 minutes. We're close. So questions, thoughts, experiences?
Very thorough. That was a really good presentation.
Thank you, Brittany, for your time.
Of course.
Appreciate it.
Really, really grateful to be here with you all. Sorry I have a hard time not being verbose, and there is just a lot to kind of speak to, and like I said, always open to a side conversation and or follow-up if anyone's interested. So.
I do have a worksheet here that I wanted to give you to take with you. I think it's a really good tool that you can encourage your athletes to use and that you can do with them. And it's just a monthly goal check-in. A lot of coaches already do this with their groups, but I think in terms of encouraging that, again, that behavioral trait of being able to converse about one's athletic trajectory, I think that is a very observable behavior that's inherent to deeply focused and committed athletes. So this is a worksheet that you can use to facilitate that. And it's really just getting a sense of what are their goals, how are they going to do them, and why are they doing them. You know, that outcome, process, resonance. So I've got a couple of these up here. And again, these are also in the program as well. But I think that could be an effective tool to use.
I like how you put the nervous system in both your talks. You know, like I teach emergency medicine, it's all about the nervous system, but it's here in this environment too.
Yeah. And to that point, just briefly, fight or flight is awesome for an athlete. We want that. What I see in a lot of work here, a lot of athletes, is that it's just over-tapped most of the time. They're just, you know, they get to that event in February and their nervous system is tapped because they've been in fight or flight for the last 5 or 6 months.
Totally.
And when it's time to like rely on adrenaline and cortisol to help our performance, it's just not there. Right? So being able to kind of balance it out, I think that's the key to really successful athletics in the long term.
Yeah, your sympathetic is your fight or flight, and your parasympathetic is your rest and digest.
Yep.
So that's where the sleep and the stress management and centering in when we're actually eating our meals is helping to counterbalance the state that we're otherwise always in.
Yep. Yes, sir.
When you talk about the goals, kind of come to personal philosophy with our kids, in that at younger ages, I'm focusing way more on the inputs in the process, because I feel like there's already enough pressure on the outcome that they're going to get.
Yep.
You know, whether they make a team or they qualify for postseason, there's already a lot of that. So in the goals of the process, I'm just trying to say, worry about the input, worry about the process. The outcomes come later. Probably as they get older, maybe focus more on that. But can you just talk a little bit, like, do you change your emphasis on process input versus outcome, thinking about kind of where they are in their trajectory, you know, 10-year-old versus 16-year-old, and kind of how you're having that conversation around that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think having that conversation at an early age is really important, like you're doing. Developmentally, 13, 14, 15, a lot of athletes are in this egocentric stage where the world is looking at them, right? Outcomes are sort of defining their identity. So we don't need to worry about talking about results at that point. And I think the default question that usually comes up was, how did it go, right? And usually that sort of frames a good or bad answer. So I think if you can subtly kind of rework the question into a process-oriented question, like tell me about the day. Like tell me kind of how you went through the day. You know, what kinds of things surprised you? Sort of ask those kinds of questions. I think it sends that message a little more towards that process focus like you're talking about, because the outcomes are there. They know exactly where they finished, they know exactly who was ahead of them, and they know exactly who was behind them. We don't need to reinforce that. As they start to get older though, 16, 17, 18, they start to morph out of that egocentric phase of development. I think the outcome goals, and specifically realistic outcome goals, become really important. Far too often we ask athletes what their goals are, and they're not realistic, and we just let them go. Like, oh, that's great. Well, if we go back to that matrix that talked about, you know, skill level and challenge and how we get to flow, oftentimes if those two things aren't matching up, if the goals are super unrealistic, that athlete's never going to get into flow, right? And they're never going to get to experience that feeling of kind of being in the zone, kind of meeting like right up against their ability, like the challenge is just perfectly suited for their skill level. So I think the outcome goals become really important at that point. Does that make sense?
And for anyone who would care for it, I do have like a handout that really kind of summarizes a lot of what I spoke about with a lot of those examples. You're welcome to take it, business cards, and again, happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Yep. Great. Well, thanks again for your time. We will send the slides out, and yeah, if you have any questions, we'll stick around a little bit.